Vivian Clark's hands hovered over the manila folder on her desk, her perfectly manicured nails tapping lightly against the paper. The envelope bore no company logo, no indication of its source. Only a single word written in block letters across the front: confidential. She had read its contents 3 times, each pass deepening the knot in her stomach. Inside, there were testimonies from employees at her company's main distribution center, accounts of excessive overtime, missing wages, and a manager whose cruelty had turned the workplace into a battlefield of fear. The words weren't dramatic. They were bleak, stripped of embellishment, which made them hit harder. Vivian had built Clark & Company from the ground up. What had started as a boutique fashion catalog had grown into an empire. From her sleek high-rise office, she had prided herself on fostering an inclusive brand. She believed she had created something fair, something good. This report suggested otherwise. She could have sent an internal auditor, conducted formal interviews, but she knew how these things worked. A few emails, a few pre-announced inspections, and everything would be swept under the rug before the truth could surface. She needed to see it for herself. A plan formed with startling clarity. For the first time in 15 years, Vivian Clark would disappear. 2 days later, Maya Brooks stood outside the Clark & Company distribution center, adjusting the strap of her worn-out backpack. The air smelled of gasoline and damp cardboard, the pavement still wet from an earlier rain. The transformation was complete. Gone were the designer heels, the tailored blazers, the subtle fragrance of imported perfume. She had stripped herself down to something unremarkable: faded jeans, a plain hoodie, and sneakers that pinched slightly at the toes. Her golden brown hair, usually a cascade of soft waves, was now tied into a low, uneven ponytail, darkened slightly with an over-the-counter dye. No one gave her a second glance. At the security desk, a board guard barely looked up as she handed over the fake ID her assistant had arranged. "Maya Brooks," he muttered, flipping through a clipboard. He gestured lazily toward the interior. "New hires report to Dock 3. Try not to get lost." The warehouse was a world away from her office's quiet luxury. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering in places, casting a sterile glow over the endless rows of towering metal shelves. Conveyor belts whirred, forklifts beeped, and the constant shuffling of feet echoed through the cavernous space. Vivian's heart pounded as she weaved through the chaos, following the stream of workers toward a waiting area. It had been over a decade since she'd last set foot in one of her company's warehouses, back when she was still running shipments herself out of a cramped rental space. A sharp whistle cut through the noise. "All right, listen up." A thick-set man stood at the front of the group, his arms crossed over his chest. His shirt was stretched too tight over his stomach, and a ring of sweat darkened the fabric near his collar. He had the stance of someone who knew he didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. His presence alone carried the weight of authority. "Troy Henshaw," he said, voice like gravel. "Warehouse supervisor. That means what I say is law. You work hard, we don't have problems. You slack off, you'll be out of here faster than you can blink. Simple enough." The group murmured quiet assent. Vivian kept her expression neutral, but something in the man's gaze made her uneasy. One by one he assigned positions. Some were sent to loading, others to sorting. When he reached Vivian, his lip curled slightly. "New girl, you're unpacking. Bay 6. He barely looked at her before moving on. Bay 6 was a narrow aisle lined with metal tables, where employees packed clothing orders into boxes before sealing them for shipment. The work was mind-numbing. Select an item, scan the tag, fold, place, tape, repeat. Within minutes, Vivian's fingers ached from the repetitive motion. "Careful, don't overfill," a voice said beside her. Vivian turned to see a woman in her mid-30s, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun. She had a warm but tired smile, her hands moving swiftly as she packed a set of silk scarves into a shipping box. "Elena Ramirez," she introduced herself. "Maya," Vivian responded, the fake name slipping naturally from her lips. Elena nodded toward the supervisor. "Welcome to the trenches. Keep your head down and don't piss off Henshaw." Vivian's gaze flicked back toward Troy. He loomed over another worker, inspecting their station with a sneer. What happens if you do? She asked. Elena sighed. Depends. If he's in a good mood, maybe a write-up. If he's not, you get shifts cut, or worse. He'll find a reason to fire you. He likes to remind us we're replaceable. Vivian clenched her jaw. For the next few hours, she worked in silence, watching, listening. The warehouse had its own rhythm, a delicate balance of efficiency and survival. People worked fast, but not too fast. They talked in hushed voices, never lingering too long in one place. She saw the way they flinched when Troy walked by, how conversations died when he was near. It was subtle but unmistakable, a culture of fear. Her moment of revelation came just after lunch. Elena had barely sat down when Troy's voice sliced through the air. Ramirez. The woman stiffened, rising quickly to her feet. Yes, sir? You've got orders backed up from this morning. Break's over. Get moving. Vivian glanced at the clock. Elena had only been sitting for 3 minutes. But Troy's expression darkened. What was that? Elena hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Vivian could see the battle in her eyes. Speak up and risk her job, or swallow her dignity to keep food on the table. The silence stretched. Finally, Elena dropped her gaze. Nothing. I'll get back to work. Smart choice. Troy smirked, already turning away. Vivian felt something hot coil in her chest, something dangerously close to fury. She had expected inefficiencies. She had expected minor complaints. But this was something else. And she was only just getting started. The days blurred into a grueling rhythm. Morning shifts bled into afternoon ones, punctuated by the hum of conveyor belts and the dull ache that settled into Vivian's limbs. She was exhausted in a way she hadn't been in years. Not the kind of exhaustion that came from high-stakes boardroom meetings, but the slow, grinding fatigue of physical labor under an unrelenting gaze. Troy Henshaw's presence was everywhere. He moved through the warehouse like a predator, his heavy boots echoing against the concrete floors. His eyes lingered on workers just long enough to make them uncomfortable, his sneering voice a constant reminder that, here, he was king. Vivian had never seen a workplace so tense, so devoid of spirit. The employees avoided eye contact, keeping their heads low, their movements economical. Fear lived in their silence. She noticed it in the way Elena worked, fast, efficient, but never drawing attention to herself. She was careful, calculated. And yet, it didn't matter. Troy had made her a target. Too slow, Ramirez, he barked one afternoon, standing over her station. If I wanted a sloth handling orders, I'd hire one from the damn zoo. Elena's hands didn't falter, but Vivian saw the way her jaw clenched. I've packed over 200 boxes today, Elena said, her voice steady but quiet. I'm meeting quota. Troy leaned in, his breath heavy with coffee. Is that attitude I hear? Vivian's fists tightened at her sides. She wanted to say something, but she forced herself to wait. Observe. If she spoke too soon, she wouldn't see the full extent of the problem. Troy's smirk widened when Elena didn't answer. He grabbed a half-packed box from her station, tipped it over, and sent its contents spilling onto the floor. Do it again, he said, walking away. Vivian stared at the mess of fabric and packing materials, at Elena's stiff posture as she knelt to gather the scattered items. The rules here were clear: comply or suffer. That night, Vivian sat on the thin mattress of her temporary apartment, a rental arranged under her assumed identity. Her muscles throbbed, but she barely noticed. She was too busy rereading the notes she had started keeping, documenting everything. Unpaid overtime, intimidation tactics, unjustified firings. A pattern was emerging, and it was worse than she had imagined. By the end of the week, she had seen enough. Payroll discrepancies were common. Workers clocked in for 10-hour shifts, but were only compensated for 8. Overtime hours mysteriously disappeared from paychecks, replaced by vague deductions labeled processing fees. When questioned, the answers were always the same. It's an accounting error. Talk to HR. It'll be fixed next cycle. The fixes never came. More troubling was the way Troy dangled power over those most desperate. He targeted employees with families, single parents, older workers, people who couldn't afford to fight back. One evening, Vivian found herself walking alongside Elena as they left for the night. The warehouse emptied quickly, workers eager to put distance between themselves and their misery. "Has it always been like this?" Vivian asked. Elena let out a short, humorless laugh. "No, it used to be worse." Vivian frowned. "Worse." Elena glanced around as if checking for listening ears before lowering her voice. "Before Troy, we had another manager. He was different. Tough, but fair. People actually liked working here." "What happened?" Elena hesitated. "He tried to file a complaint about labor violations. Next thing we knew, he was gone. No explanation, no goodbye. They replaced him with Troy." Vivian absorbed the information, her mind racing. "Why don't people report what's happening?" Elena gave her a knowing look. "Report to who? HR? They work for corporate. They don't work for us." Vivian remained quiet, guilt pressing into her ribs. She was corporate. The thought made her stomach twist. Had she truly been so blind to the reality of her own company? Before she could say anything, a voice interrupted them. "Don't get too comfortable." Jackson Lee stood a few feet away, hands shoved into the pockets of his worn-out hoodie. He was younger than most of the warehouse staff, sharp-eyed but withdrawn. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried weight. "People who get too involved don't last long here," Jackson continued. His eyes flickered toward Elena. "You should be careful who you trust." Elena sighed, but didn't argue. "See you tomorrow, Maya." Vivian watched her disappear down the street before turning to Jackson. "You seem to know a lot about what happens around here." He tilted his head slightly, considering her. "I know how to keep my job." "By staying quiet?" He shrugged. "By staying invisible." Vivian crossed her arms. "And what happens when everyone stays invisible?" A small, wry smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Then people like Troy win." With that, he walked away, leaving her standing alone in the dim glow of the streetlights. That night, Vivian barely slept. The next morning, the warehouse was charged with an unusual energy. Workers whispered in hushed voices, casting nervous glances toward the office windows. Then she saw why. Elena stood at her station, but something was wrong. Her shoulders were stiff, her hands unmoving. Troy stood across from her, arms crossed, a satisfied smirk on his face. "You're done," he said. Elena blinked. "What?" "You're fired," Troy repeated, dragging out the words. "Something about performance issues." He turned to another worker, feigning confusion. "Strange. Didn't I warn her about that just last week?" Elena's face drained of color. "You can't do this." Troy leaned in. "I can do whatever I want." The warehouse fell into an eerie silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Vivian felt something inside her snap. She stepped forward. "This isn't right." Troy's gaze swung to her, his expression darkening. "Excuse me." Vivian forced herself to keep her voice even. "She's one of the best workers here. You're firing her for no reason." Troy took a slow step toward her, his smirk widening. "And who the hell do you think you are?" The words sent a sharp thrill through her. He didn't know. Not yet. The moment was coming. But not here. Not now. She exhaled slowly, forcing her hands to unclench. "Nobody," she murmured. "Just someone who sees what's happening." Troy let out a low chuckle. "Then, do yourself a favor. Keep your mouth shut." Elena swallowed hard, looking around at the faces watching, waiting. But no one came to her defense. With slow, deliberate movements, she untied her apron and let it drop onto the conveyor belt. Without another word, she turned and walked away. Troy clapped his hands together. Back to work. Vivian stood frozen, anger burning through her veins. This had gone far enough. By the time she reached her station, her decision was made. Troy thought he ruled this place. He was about to learn otherwise. The silence in the warehouse felt heavier after Elena's departure. The workers moved like ghosts, their expressions carefully blank, their motions mechanical. No one dared to acknowledge what had happened, as if pretending it away would keep them safe. But Vivian couldn't pretend. Troy Henshaw had made a mistake. He believed fear was power, That intimidation could smother resistance. He had no idea that his days of unchecked rule were numbered. Vivian spent the next 24 hours preparing. She pulled every resource at her disposal, reaching out to her assistant under strict confidentiality. Documents were pulled, payroll records retrieved, internal complaints unearthed. By the time she stepped into the warehouse the following morning, she was ready. The day started as usual, cold, indifferent. The workers shuffled to their stations. Troy made his rounds, exuding smug satisfaction. He thrived on the tension, feeding off the unspoken knowledge that everyone here was powerless against him. Vivian let the hours pass, waiting for her moment. Then, just before noon, the door to the warehouse office swung open. Two figures stepped inside. One was a woman in a crisp navy suit, her polished demeanor standing in stark contrast to the industrial chaos around her. The other was a man in his 50s, with silver-threaded hair and the unmistakable air of someone who mattered. Martin Kane, Clark & Company's Director of Operations. Vivian had sent for them. Troy's smugness faltered when he saw them. The shift was slight, but Vivian caught it, the momentary flicker of uncertainty in his eyes before he masked it with arrogance. He straightened his spine, forcing a casual smile. Didn't know we were expecting a visit. Martin surveyed the warehouse with cool detachment before his gaze settled on Troy. We weren't. A hush rippled through the workers. Heads lifted. Hands stilled. For the first time in weeks, the balance of power felt uncertain. Vivian took a step forward. This was it. I called them. Troy's head snapped toward her, confusion flashing across his face. You. Vivian held his gaze, and then, before he could piece it together, she reached for the edge of her hoodie and peeled it off. Gone was Maya Brooks. Vivian Clark straightened her shoulders, her sharp gaze sweeping across the warehouse floor, taking in every stunned expression. She watched realization crash over Troy like a tidal wave. The blood drained from his face. I am Vivian Clark, she said, her voice steady but edged with steel. And I own this company. The warehouse was dead silent. Workers stood frozen, eyes darting between her and Troy, trying to comprehend the impossible. Troy recovered quickly, though not well. He barked a laugh, though it came out hollow. Nice try, lady. You expect me to believe that you're Vivian Clark. He turned to Martin, scoffing. Tell me this is a joke. Martin didn't so much as blink. It's not. Troy's smirk faded. Vivian let the weight of the moment settle before she spoke again. I've spent the last 2 weeks here. I've seen how you run this warehouse. I've seen how you treat my employees. And I've seen enough. The panic set in then, subtle but visible. A twitch in Troy's jaw, the flex of his fingers at his sides. He wasn't the kind of man who handled losing well. You've got it all wrong, he said quickly. These people, he gestured vaguely at the workers, who stood motionless, waiting. They like to complain. They exaggerate. You know how it is. We keep things running. I do what I have to do. Vivian's expression didn't change. So you had to dock overtime pay. Troy blinked. You had to fire employees without cause. His mouth opened, but no words came out. You had to bully, intimidate, and steal from the very people who make this company function. Vivian stepped closer, her voice low and even. Tell me, Troy, were all of those necessary? The warehouse had never been so quiet. Troy's eyes darted to Martin, as if searching for an escape, but there was none. Martin cleared his throat. I've reviewed the documentation. The violations are extensive. Unpaid wages, falsified reports, wrongful terminations. His voice was firm. You're done here, Henshaw. No, wait. Troy's composure cracked. You don't understand. I was keeping this place efficient. You can't just. I can, Vivian interrupted. Troy's jaw tightened. Anger replaced fear. He let out a sharp breath, then sneered. You think you're a hero? You think firing me fixes anything? Vivian didn't blink. I think it's a start. The sound of security boots echoed through the warehouse. 2 guards approached from the entrance, their expressions unreadable. Troy looked between them and Vivian, his confidence finally shattering. You can't. I can, she said again. And then, with quiet finality. "You're fired." The words landed with weight, an inescapable judgment. Troy stood motionless as the guard stepped in, one at each side. For a moment, he looked as if he might fight it, but he must have seen something in Vivian's expression that told him resistance was pointless. The guards led him toward the exit, past rows of silent workers who watched their tormentor fall. Just as he reached the door, Troy twisted his head back. His face was red, his breathing uneven. "You have no idea what you just did," he spat. Vivian held his gaze. "I know exactly what I just did." And then he was gone. The warehouse remained still. No one moved, no one spoke, as if the weight of the moment needed time to settle. Then, slowly, one by one, workers straightened. Shoulders lifted. Heads held higher. Elena was gone, but she wouldn't be the last. Others who had been wronged, who had suffered in silence, would see justice. Vivian turned to face the employees, her voice carrying across the warehouse. "This isn't over," she said. "Not yet." She looked at Martin. "Start fixing the payroll. Every unpaid hour, every missing wage. I want it corrected immediately." He nodded. Understood. Vivian inhaled deeply, scanning the faces before her. "We rebuild," she said simply. The workers exchanged glances, cautious hope flickering in their eyes. For the first time since she arrived, the warehouse didn't feel suffocating. For the first time, change had come. And it had only just begun. The warehouse felt different. The air, once thick with fear, carried something else now: anticipation, uncertainty, a cautious hope that no one dared to speak aloud. The workers moved through the space with wary eyes, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Vivian knew trust wasn't rebuilt in a day. The aftermath of Troy Henshaw's firing rippled through the company like a shockwave. News spread fast, through break-room whispers, late-night text chains, and the unspoken electricity that passed between employees who had long since learned to keep their heads down. For the first time in years, they weren't afraid to look up. Vivian wasted no time. The payroll team was instructed to audit every discrepancy, ensuring that stolen wages were returned. Termination records were reviewed, and wrongful firings flagged for reconsideration. A third-party compliance team was brought in to investigate deeper issues, exposing practices that had been buried under layers of bureaucratic neglect. But numbers were the easy part. Fixing balance sheets wouldn't erase the scars Troy had left behind. So she did something that CEOs rarely did. She showed up, not as an executive issuing mandates from an office, but as a leader who listened. Day after day, she walked the warehouse floor not as Maya Brooks, the undercover temp, but as Vivian Clark, the woman who should have seen the cracks before they became chasms. She spoke with employees, not just in passing, but with intention. She sat beside them at lunch. She asked about their lives outside of work. She learned names, stories, struggles. Jackson Lee was the first to approach her, standing at the edge of the break room, arms crossed. "So what now?" His tone was careful, like a man who had been disappointed too many times to believe in promises. Vivian met his gaze. "Now we fix what's broken." His jaw tightened, skepticism flickering in his eyes. "And when you leave, what stops this place from falling apart again?" It was a fair question, a real question. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "We don't just patch things up. We change the foundation." Jackson studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He didn't smile, but the tension in his shoulders eased just enough to show that, maybe, he believed her. The following week, she invited Elena back. It wasn't enough to offer her job back, Vivian knew that. So, she gave her something more. A promotion. A position that would give her the authority to ensure what had happened to her never happened again. When Elena arrived, there was hesitation in her step, as if she didn't quite trust that this wasn't another trick. But when she sat across from Vivian, listening to the offer, the uncertainty melted into something stronger. "I don't want a title if it doesn't mean anything," Elena said, her voice steady. "I want a real say in how things run." Vivian nodded. "That's exactly what I'm offering." A long silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Elena extended her hand. Vivian shook it. The moment was small, but it carried weight. Change wasn't just coming. It had begun. As weeks passed, the warehouse transformed. Policies were rewritten. Employee concerns were not just heard, but acted upon. For the first time in years, the people who kept the company running had a voice. One afternoon, as Vivian walked the warehouse floor, she heard something unexpected. Laughter. Not forced, not anxious, real laughter. A joke shared between workers as they packed shipments. A moment of ease where there had once only been tension. She paused, taking in. This was what mattered. Not profits, not expansion, not the shiny reports shareholders loved. This. She turned, heading toward the exit. At the door, she caught sight of Jackson leaning against a workstation, watching her. Not bad, he admitted. Vivian smiled. It's a start. She stepped outside, inhaling deeply. The world felt lighter. For the first time in a long time, she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. And she wasn't done yet.